Today, we're going to explore a different way of thinking about scientific reading. This is not a lecture about artificial intelligence, nor is it about learning how to use ChatGPT. Instead, we'll examine what large language models, or LLMs, can teach us about becoming better researchers. As engineers and scientists, we spend a significant portion of our careers reading technical papers, reports, standards, and regulations. Yet, very few of us are formally taught how to read scientific literature effectively. We often focus on reading more papers, when the real objective should be understanding, evaluating, and applying knowledge more efficiently. Throughout this presentation, we'll compare several information processing strategies used by LLMs with the habits of experienced researchers. We'll see how techniques such as identifying semantic patterns, building knowledge structures, making predictions, maintaining focus, and applying knowledge can improve the way we conduct literature reviews and evaluate scientific evidence. Although the mechanisms of human intelligence and artificial intelligence are fundamentally different, they often converge on similar principles for processing complex information. By the end of this session, I hope you'll leave with a practical framework that helps you read more strategically, think more critically, and ultimately become a more effective researcher in petroleum engineering and the broader geoenergy and geoenvironment disciplines. Good researchers do not read papers word by word. They read for ideas. This is one of the most interesting lessons we can learn from large language models. Although an LLM processes text mathematically, its strength comes from recognizing relationships between concepts rather than treating every word as equally important. Expert researchers behave in a remarkably similar way. Suppose you are reading a paper on sustained casing pressure. If you focus on every individual sentence, you may spend 20 minutes reading a single section without understanding its real contribution. Instead, begin by asking a simple question. What is the main idea this paragraph is trying to communicate? Perhaps the paragraph is explaining the mechanism of microannulus formation, discussing a pressure monitoring technique, or comparing regulatory approaches. Once you identify the central idea, the individual sentences become supporting evidence rather than isolated pieces of information. When I read petroleum engineering papers, I rarely highlight entire paragraphs. Instead, I summarize each paragraph in 3 or 4 words such as cement degradation mechanism, pressure diagnostic method, or risk assessment framework. Those labels become my mental map of the paper. This approach is especially valuable when reviewing dozens of journal articles for a literature review. Rather than remembering hundreds of sentences, you remember a structured collection of ideas. As researchers, our objective is not to finish reading the paper. Our objective is to understand the author's contribution. That starts by reading ideas, not words. Now let's build on a strategy. Once you've learned to read ideas instead of words, the next step is to identify semantic chunks. A semantic chunk is simply a group of information that forms one meaningful concept. Large language models process text in pieces rather than as one enormous block. They continuously organize related information into meaningful units before using that information to generate responses. Expert researchers do something very similar. Consider reading a paper on well integrity. You could see hundreds of sentences describing cement properties, casing design, corrosion, pressure testing, and regulatory requirements. If you treat every sentence as separate information, your working memory becomes overloaded very quickly. Instead, group related information into logical chunks. For example, one chunk may be barrier elements, including casing, cement, and wellhead components. Another chunk could be failure mechanisms, such as corrosion, sustained casing pressure, microannulus formation, and thermal cycling. A third chunk might focus on diagnostic methods, including pressure monitoring, cement bond logs, temperature surveys, and leak detection techniques. Instead of remembering 50 individual facts, you now remember 3 organized concepts. This dramatically reduces cognitive load while improving understanding. The same approach applies when reading research papers on carbon capture and storage. Rather than memorizing every paragraph, organize the information into chunks such as storage mechanisms, caprock integrity, risk assessment, monitoring technologies, and regulatory compliance. This is exactly how experienced researchers conduct literature reviews. They don't collect isolated facts. They organize knowledge into meaningful conceptual blocks that can later be compared across multiple papers. As your research experience grows, these semantic chunks become larger and richer. That is one of the reasons experts can read technical literature much faster than beginners. They are recognizing familiar knowledge structures instead of processing every sentence from scratch. The goal is simple: don't collect information. Build organized knowledge. One of the biggest mistakes students make is trying to memorize information before understanding what kind of information they are reading. Large language models organize information into patterns and relationships before generating a response. They don't treat every sentence equally. Expert researchers work in much the same way. Imagine you're conducting a literature review on geological hydrogen storage. After reading only a few papers, you'll encounter laboratory experiments, numerical reservoir simulations, field pilot projects, economic analyses, and regulatory guidance. If you try to memorize every result, you'll soon lose sight of the bigger picture. Instead, classify the information first. Ask yourself: is this describing a physical mechanism? Is this presenting experimental evidence? Is this a numerical modeling study? Is this a field demonstration? Is this identifying a limitation or uncertainty? Is this proposing future research? Once each paper is organized into these categories, comparisons become much easier. The same approach applies to reservoir engineering. When reviewing papers on water flooding, separate information into reservoir characterization, fluid properties, simulation methodology, production performance, and economic evaluation. Now you can compare studies objectively because you're comparing similar types of evidence. Suppose you're reviewing geothermal reservoir studies. One paper may focus on fracture permeability, another on heat extraction efficiency, and a third on induced seismicity. These are not competing findings, they belong to different categories within the same research area. Experienced researchers don't memorize hundreds of disconnected facts. They build organized knowledge structures that allow them to identify trends, contradictions, and research gaps. Before asking, "How do I remember this paper?" ask, "Where does this information belong?" Classification is the bridge between reading and critical analysis. Once information is organized, remembering it becomes much easier, and synthesizing multiple papers becomes a natural process. As your research career progresses, you'll notice something interesting about experienced researchers. They don't remember hundreds of papers. Instead, they remember the structure of a research field. Large language models work in a similar way. They connect information across multiple levels rather than treating every sentence as an isolated fact. Expert researchers build similar mental structures. Let me give you an example. Suppose your research topic is enhanced geothermal systems. A beginner might read papers one after another, collecting notes without seeing how they relate. After 10 papers, they have pages of information but no clear understanding of the field. An experienced researcher starts differently. Before reading, they build a simple mental framework. At the top is the research question. What controls the performance of an enhanced geothermal system? That question immediately divides into several major themes. The first is reservoir characterization. Here you'll find papers discussing rock properties, natural fractures, stress fields, permeability, and reservoir temperature. The second is stimulation techniques. These papers investigate hydraulic stimulation, thermal stimulation, fracture propagation, and permeability enhancement. The third is heat extraction performance, covering production rates, thermal breakthrough, reservoir lifetime, and energy recovery. A fourth branch might be environmental and operational risks, including induced seismicity, water management, and regulatory compliance. Now every paper you read has a natural place within this framework. Imagine reading a paper about fracture propagation. Instead of thinking, "I need to remember this paper," you immediately recognize that it belongs under stimulation techniques. Another paper discussing induced seismicity belongs under environmental risks. Your brain is no longer storing isolated papers. It is expanding a well-organized knowledge map. This approach is also extremely useful when writing your literature review. Rather than summarizing papers one by one, organize your review around these major themes. The literature review becomes a logical story instead of a list of authors. One practical exercise I recommend is this. Before reading your first paper on any research topic, spend 5 minutes drawing a simple tree with 4 or 5 main branches. As you read more papers, continue expanding that tree. After 20 papers, you'll have a complete map of the research landscape. That is exactly how experienced researchers identify knowledge gaps. They don't look for missing papers. They look for branches of the tree that are still incomplete. A good researcher doesn't simply build a library of papers. They build a mental model of the entire subject. That mental model becomes the foundation for critical thinking, literature reviews, and ultimately, original research. One of the biggest differences between passive reading and active reading is what happens when you reach the end of a paragraph. Most students simply continue to the next paragraph. Expert researchers pause, even if only for a few seconds, and ask themselves, what was the main message of that paragraph? Interestingly, large language models operate in a similar way. As they process text, they continuously update their internal understanding based on everything they have read so far. They don't wait until the end of an entire document before making sense of it. As researchers, we should adopt the same habit. Let's consider that you're reading a paper on CO2 injectivity in a saline aquifer. The first paragraph may describe reservoir properties. The second explains the numerical simulation model. The third discusses pressure buildup during injection. The fourth evaluates operational constraints. Rather than reading all 4 paragraphs continuously, pause after each one and produce a one-sentence summary in your own words. For example, this paragraph explains why permeability controls injectivity. Or, the author selected a radial reservoir model to evaluate pressure propagation. Notice that you are not copying the author's words. You are translating the information into your own understanding. This simple habit has several advantages. First, it immediately reveals whether you actually understood what you just read. If you cannot explain the paragraph in one sentence, you probably need to read it again. Second, it prevents information overload. Instead of carrying 5 pages of unread thoughts in your working memory, you continuously organize and consolidate your understanding. Third, these one-sentence summaries become excellent notes for your literature review. Months later, you won't need to reread the entire paper because each paragraph has already been distilled into its essential message. Here's a practical technique that I use when reviewing scientific papers. In the margin of every important paragraph, I write 3 to 7 words that capture its main contribution. By the time I finish the paper, I've created a structured outline without writing pages of notes. This method is particularly valuable when reviewing large numbers of papers. Instead of remembering dozens of paragraphs, you remember a sequence of key ideas. Research is not about reading faster. It is about understanding better. And understanding begins when you stop reading long enough to explain what you've just learned in your own words. One of the most valuable lessons we can learn from large language models is the importance of maintaining context. An LLM processes information as one continuous sequence, where each sentence helps interpret the next. If the context is interrupted, the quality of understanding decreases. The same principle applies to researchers. When reading a scientific paper, every interruption forces your brain to rebuild its understanding. Checking emails, replying to messages, or switching between papers may seem harmless, but each distraction breaks your concentration and increases cognitive load. Consider reading a paper on hydrogen storage in depleted gas reservoirs. The authors first explain the geological setting, then describe the simulation model, followed by sensitivity analysis and finally their conclusions. Each section depends on the previous one. If your attention is constantly interrupted, you lose the logical flow and begin remembering isolated facts instead of the complete scientific argument. Experienced researchers therefore protect their attention. Before starting a paper, they remove distractions, silence notifications, and focus on a single objective. A practical technique is to begin with one research question, such as, what controls hydrogen containment efficiency? As you read, evaluate every section against that question. This keeps your attention directed toward understanding rather than simply finishing the paper. Research is not about reading more papers. It is about thinking more deeply about the papers you read. Deep focus allows you to connect ideas, evaluate evidence, and develop insights that ultimately lead to better research and stronger scientific contributions. One of the most interesting similarities between expert researchers and large language models is that neither begins reading with an empty mind. Both generate expectations before processing new information. An LLM continuously predicts what information is likely to come next based on the context it has already received. As new text appears, it confirms, rejects, or updates those predictions. Expert researchers work in much the same way. Before reading a journal paper, don't immediately start with the abstract. First examine the title, keywords, figures, section headings, and conclusions. Then ask yourself, what do I expect this paper to contribute? For example, imagine you're reading a paper titled, Machine Learning for Predicting CO2 Storage Capacity. Before reading, you might predict that the study will discuss reservoir properties, feature selection, model training, validation, and uncertainty analysis. As you read, compare those expectations with the evidence presented by the authors. This approach transforms reading into an active dialogue rather than passive information gathering. Every section either confirms your expectations or challenges your existing understanding. This strategy is equally valuable for journal reviewers. Experienced reviewers often form an initial expectation from the title, abstract, and research objective before examining the methodology and results. Throughout the review, they continuously ask, does the evidence support the claims, and does the methodology justify the conclusions? Their predictions are refined as they evaluate the manuscript critically. Whether you are reading a paper, conducting a literature review, or reviewing a manuscript, prediction keeps your mind actively engaged. The objective is not to guess correctly, but to compare your expectations with the evidence and strengthen your scientific judgment. One characteristic that distinguishes expert researchers from beginners is their ability to compress large amounts of information into a few meaningful concepts. Large language models do something similar. They transform vast amounts of text into compact internal representations that preserve meaning without retaining every individual word. Experienced researchers apply the same principle. Imagine you've just finished reading 10 journal papers on offshore wind foundation design. A beginner may have pages of notes, highlighted paragraphs, and dozens of bookmarked figures. An expert, however, might summarize the entire collection into just a few key ideas, such as fatigue loading, soil structure interaction, scour effects, structural reliability, and life cycle assessment. Those 5 concepts become anchors for everything they have learned. This approach is particularly useful during a literature review. Instead of writing detailed notes for every paper, ask yourself, if I could only keep one sentence from this paper, what would it be? For example, rather than copying an entire paragraph, you might write, fracture permeability is the dominant control on geothermal reservoir productivity. That single sentence captures the paper's central contribution. The same strategy is widely used by experienced journal reviewers. They often read an entire manuscript and then reduce it to a concise statement. What is the research question? What is the main contribution? What is the key limitation? If these cannot be expressed clearly, the manuscript itself may lack focus. As researchers, our goal is not to remember every detail. Our goal is to identify the ideas that matter most. Information can fill notebooks, but compressed knowledge builds expertise. The better you become at reducing complexity into clear scientific concepts, the more effectively you will read, write, review, and communicate research. Attention is one of the most valuable resources a researcher has. Just as we manage time and money carefully, we should also manage our attention. Large language models don't treat every piece of information equally. They assign greater importance to the parts of the context that are most relevant to the task. Expert researchers do something similar when reading scientific papers. Not every sentence deserves the same level of attention. For example, suppose you're reading a paper on offshore carbon storage. The introduction provides useful background, but the sections that deserve your deepest attention are the research question, methodology, assumptions, results, and discussion. These sections reveal the originality, quality, and limitations of the study. Experienced researchers deliberately allocate their attention. They spend more time analyzing figures, tables, equations, and experimental design than reading general background information. They ask questions such as, is the methodology appropriate, are the assumptions reasonable, and do the data support the conclusions? This strategy is particularly important for journal reviewers. A reviewer does not read every sentence with equal intensity. Instead, they focus on the scientific contribution, the validity of the methods, the quality of the evidence, and whether the conclusions are supported by the results. A practical technique is to divide your attention into 3 levels. Give high attention to the research objective, methodology, results, and limitations. Give moderate attention to the literature review and discussion. Give lower attention to information that simply provides background or repeats established knowledge. Research is not about reading every word equally. It is about directing your attention where scientific value is created. The better you manage your attention, the faster you identify important contributions, recognize weaknesses, and become a more effective researcher. One of the biggest mistakes researchers make is opening a paper and immediately reading the first sentence. Expert researchers rarely do that. They first build context. Large language models also depend heavily on context. The more relevant information available before processing new text, the more accurate and meaningful the interpretation becomes. Researchers should adopt the same approach. Suppose you are about to read a paper on offshore hydrogen production using electrolysis. Before reading, ask yourself 3 simple questions. What problem is the paper trying to solve? What do I already know about this topic? What information am I hoping to learn? These questions activate your existing knowledge and prepare your brain to connect new information with what you already understand. Next, spend 2 or 3 minutes scanning the paper. Read the title, abstract, figures, tables, and conclusions. Look at the section headings and identify the overall structure before reading the details. By doing this, you create a mental framework. Every paragraph you read now has a place within that framework, making comprehension faster and more effective. This approach is particularly useful during literature reviews. Rather than reading papers randomly, first understand where each paper fits within the broader research landscape. Is it proposing a new methodology? Validating an existing model? Presenting field data? Or identifying a research gap? Journal reviewers use exactly the same strategy. Before evaluating the technical details, they first understand the purpose, novelty, and intended contribution of the manuscript. That context helps them judge whether the methodology and conclusions are appropriate. Remember, understanding does not begin with the first sentence. It begins before you start reading. Building context allows you to read with purpose, connect ideas more effectively, and evaluate research with greater confidence. Many students believe they should understand a research paper in a single reading. In reality, that is rarely how research works. Experienced researchers read papers in multiple passes, with each pass serving a different purpose. Large language models also refine their understanding as information flows through multiple computational layers. While the mechanism is different from the human brain, the principle is similar. Understanding develops progressively rather than instantly. As researchers, we should adopt the same strategy. Consider reading a paper on reservoir simulation for geothermal energy. During the first reading, don't worry about the equations or detailed results. Simply answer one question: what is this paper about? During the second reading, focus on the methodology. Ask yourself, why did the authors choose this modeling approach? What assumptions were made? In the third pass, critically evaluate the results. Are the conclusions supported by the data? What are the limitations? Could another methodology have produced different outcomes? Finally, relate the paper to your own research. Does it fill a knowledge gap? Does it challenge existing studies? Can its methodology be adapted to your project? This layered approach is also common among journal reviewers. The first reading provides an overall impression. The second evaluates scientific quality. The third checks technical details, consistency, and whether the conclusions are justified by the evidence. A practical habit is to divide every paper into 4 passes. Pass 1, understand the objective. Pass 2, analyze the methodology. Pass 3, evaluate the evidence. Pass 4, connect the findings to your own research. Don't expect complete understanding in one reading. Every pass should deepen your comprehension, strengthen your critical thinking, and reveal insights that were not obvious before. That's how experienced researchers transform information into expertise. Many students believe they should understand a research paper in a single reading. In reality, that is rarely how research works. Experienced researchers read papers in multiple passes, with each pass serving a different purpose. Large language models also refine their understanding as information flows through multiple computational layers. While the mechanism is different from the human brain, the principle is similar. Understanding develops progressively rather than instantly. As researchers, we should adopt the same strategy. Consider reading a paper on reservoir simulation for geothermal energy. During the first reading, don't worry about the equations or detailed results. Simply answer one question: what is this paper about? During the second reading, focus on the methodology. Ask yourself, why did the authors choose this modeling approach? What assumptions were made? In the third pass, critically evaluate the results. Are the conclusions supported by the data? What are the limitations? Could another methodology have produced different outcomes? Finally, relate the paper to your own research. Does it fill a knowledge gap? Does it challenge existing studies? Can its methodology be adapted to your project? This layered approach is also common among journal reviewers. The first reading provides an overall impression. The second evaluates scientific quality. The third checks technical details, consistency, and whether the conclusions are justified by the evidence. A practical habit is to divide every paper into 4 passes. Pass 1, understand the objective. Pass 2, analyze the methodology. Pass 3, evaluate the evidence. Pass 4, connect the findings to your own research. Don't expect complete understanding in one reading. Every pass should deepen your comprehension, strengthen your critical thinking, and reveal insights that were not obvious before. That's how experienced researchers transform information into expertise. As we conclude, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Throughout this presentation, we've explored several strategies inspired by large language models. But the purpose was never to compare humans with AI. The purpose was to understand how expert researchers process information more effectively. An LLM can process enormous volumes of text and identify patterns. However, it does not formulate research questions, exercise engineering judgment, or take responsibility for scientific conclusions. That remains the role of the researcher. As petroleum and geoenergy engineers, our value is not determined by how many papers we read. It is determined by how well we think. We create value by organizing knowledge, critically evaluating evidence, challenging assumptions, and applying what we learn to solve real engineering problems. Whether you're conducting a literature review, reviewing a journal manuscript, or developing your own research, remember that every paper is more than a source of information. It is an opportunity to refine your thinking and contribute something new to the field. So, don't simply aim to read more. Aim to think more deeply, question more critically, and apply knowledge more effectively. Because the next breakthrough in petroleum and geoenergy may begin with the very next paper you read, but only if you read it like a researcher. Thank you.